The morning fog in San Francisco felt peaceful, blanketing the Meridian penthouse in quiet perfection. But when a subtle iPad notification flashed, sync complete, project_exit, Julian discovered his 10-year marriage was a beautifully constructed crime scene. Inside were offshore accounts, hotel photos, and a drafted plan to frame him for fraud. Some betrayals break your heart. Others demand you burn the world down. If you love dark, suspenseful tales of calculated revenge, subscribe and stay with us. The San Francisco fog rolled over the bay, casting a cool, gray light into the penthouse of the Meridian. It was 6 in the morning, the quietest hour in Julian St. James's meticulously structured life. In the master bedroom, his wife, Margot, slept soundly, her blonde hair spilling perfectly over the silk pillowcases. After 10 years of marriage, she still looked like the elegant, untouchable woman he had fallen in love with. Julian stood at the kitchen's marble island, savoring his black coffee, relishing the peace before the daily chaos of Pemberton Tech began. Then, the screen of Margot's iPad, left carelessly on the counter, flared to life. It was a silent notification, a subtle banner that would normally vanish into the digital ether. Sync complete. Shared folder/project_exit. Julian frowned. Margot was a creative director. Her file names were usually poetic, tied to aesthetics. Project_exit sounded clinical. Cold. Driven by a rare pulse of curiosity, Julian tapped the screen. She hadn't locked it before falling asleep. The cloud drive opened, revealing a neatly organized directory. The subfolders were a masterclass in calculated destruction, asset_breakdown, offshore_routing, Derek_comms, and finally, affidavit_draft. His pulse thickened, a heavy drumbeat in his ears. He tapped Derek_comms first. A gallery of images loaded. The coffee in his stomach turned to acid. There was Margot, his graceful wife, tangled in the pristine sheets of a room at the Archer Hotel. Beside her, half-dressed and smirking at the camera, was Derek Stone, a predatory venture capitalist who had spent years trying to dismantle Julian's company. The betrayal was a physical blow, stealing his breath. But as Julian backed out of the folder and opened affidavit_draft, the pain morphed into something far colder. It wasn't just an affair. It was an assassination. His eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. It was a drafted police report, meticulously detailing how Julian had allegedly been embezzling from Pemberton Tech. The document outlined exactly how to plant fabricated financial discrepancies on his personal server. The goal was clearly stated in the margins: trigger the morality clause to nullify their ironclad prenuptial agreement. She didn't just want Derek. She wanted Julian's empire, leaving him penniless and imprisoned. Julian. Her voice, raspy with sleep, echoed softly from the hallway. Julian froze. He stared at the blueprint of his ruin, his reflection caught in the dark bezel of the iPad. The loving husband he had been just 5 minutes ago was dead, murdered by a PDF file. What remained was a CEO who specialized in hostile takeovers. Julian, is the coffee ready? Margot called out again, her bare feet approaching on the hardwood floor. Julian closed the app, turning off the screen, and placed the tablet exactly where he found it. He picked up his mug, a cold, empty smile forming on his lips. Just finished brewing, darling, he replied. Margot drifted into the kitchen, the familiar scent of her jasmine perfume cutting through the cold morning air. Once, it had been the intoxicating anchor of his day. Now, it smelled like a lie. She pressed a soft kiss to his jawline. Julian forced his facial muscles to remain perfectly slack, his hand remarkably steady as he passed her a porcelain mug of coffee. Big day at Pemberton? She asked, leaning against the marble island, a picture of effortless grace. Just the usual restructuring, Julian replied, holding her gaze with a terrifying, hollow ease. Securing our future. By noon, Julian was locked inside his soundproof corner office at Pemberton Tech. The panoramic view of the San Francisco skyline offered no comfort, only a sprawling reminder of the empire he stood to lose. He bypassed the building's primary, heavily monitored network, pulling a clean, untraceable laptop from a hidden floor safe beneath his desk. He dialed a secure line he hadn't used since the company's aggressive, cutthroat startup days. Brian Cooper answered on the second ring. Officially, Brian was a corporate security contractor. Unofficially, he was the man who dissected high-level liabilities before they could bleed into the press. "I need a shadow audit on my own wife," Julian said, the syllables tasting like ash on his tongue. "And I need full digital and physical surveillance on Derek Stone. Every encrypted text, every offshore wire, every breath he takes at the Archer Hotel." Brian's silence on the other end was heavy, calculating. "Julian, if they realize they are being monitored, they will panic and accelerate their timeline. You could force their hand before you have a defense." "They don't have a timeline anymore," Julian said, his voice dropping to a sterile, chilling register. "They are operating on mine." The rest of the afternoon was a dangerous masterclass in financial sleight of hand. To neutralize Margot's impending attack on their ironclad prenuptial agreement, Julian had to dissolve the very assets she was preparing to claim. He began quietly bleeding his own most vulnerable liquid capital, funneling millions into blind trusts deeply nested within overseas shell companies. It was a razor-thin tightrope. If Pemberton's board of directors or internal auditors flagged these massive, sudden transfers, they might legally assume he was exactly the corporate embezzler Margot and Derek were plotting to frame him as. He was risking federal prison to protect his life's work. His index finger hovered over the trackpad, ready to authorize a final, highly irregular $20 million wire transfer to a Cayman account. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door of his office clicked open without a preliminary knock. Julian's heart flatlined against his ribs. Standing in the doorway, holding a brown paper bag from his favorite artisan deli, was Margot. Her sharp blue eyes bypassed his face entirely, locking instantly onto the unauthorized, glowing screen of the burner laptop he had failed to close in time. "Working on something secret, darling?" she asked, the melodic pitch of her voice completely at odds with the sudden, predatory stillness in the room. Julian's heartbeat did not spike. It slowed to a glacial, rhythmic thud. He did not slam the burner laptop shut. Instead, he lowered the screen with deliberate, unhurried precision, meeting Margot's sharp blue eyes with a look of mild corporate exhaustion. "Just a secondary network test," Julian said, his voice as smooth as the polished mahogany desk between them. "Brian Cooper is running unannounced penetration drills on the executive floor. I had to authorize the firewall breach manually." Margot's gaze lingered on the matte black device for a fraction of a second too long. Her smile tightened, though the effortless grace of her posture never wavered. "You work too hard, Julian. Even your security protocols have security protocols. I brought pastrami from that place you love." The tension in the room diffused into the scent of smoked meat and mustard, but the silent war had officially begun. She had come to probe his defenses. He had survived the first skirmish. 3 days later, the battlefield shifted from the sterile heights of Pemberton Tech to the opulent, shadowed corridors of the Archer Hotel. Rain lashed against the windshield of Julian's rented, inconspicuous sedan, parked across from the boutique hotel's discreet side entrance. Brian's tracking software had pinpointed Margot's phone in Suite 412. Julian didn't strictly need to be here. Brian's operatives were capable of securing the footage, but a CEO never delegated the final inspection of a failing asset. He needed to witness the destruction of his marriage with his own eyes, to forge his grief into an unbreakable weapon. Slipping through the service elevator, bypassing the lobby entirely, Julian stepped onto the dimly lit, velvet-lined hallway of the 4th floor. The air smelled of expensive cedar and illicit promises. The heavy oak door to Suite 412 was cracked open just an inch. A careless, arrogant mistake by conspirators anticipating a champagne delivery. Julian pressed his back against the cool, flocked wallpaper, retrieving his phone and silencing the camera. Through the narrow gap, the scene was agonizingly clear. Derek Stone stood by the room's wet bar, pouring 2 glasses of scotch, his collar undone. Margot sat on the edge of the unmade king-sized bed, wearing the emerald silk dress Julian had bought for her in Paris. The physical intimacy of the setting struck Julian like a physical blow, a phantom ache in his ribs, but he forced his hands to remain perfectly steady. They weren't kissing. They were leaning over a small, silver flash drive resting on the nightstand. The backdoor code is embedded in these files, Derek said, his voice a low, smug rumble. Once he accesses the decoy server tomorrow, the embezzlement trail becomes permanent. Margot picked up the drive, her fingers lightly brushing Derek's wrist. Julian won't suspect a thing. He's too blindly focused on the upcoming quarterly reports. Julian raised his phone lens to the crack in the door. He captured the exchange in high resolution, the flash drive, their faces, the undeniable, damning architecture of their shared treachery. The digital evidence was secured. He was about to retreat toward the service elevator when Derek's voice drifted through the gap once more, carrying a sentence that froze the blood in Julian's veins. "Just make sure you wire the initial $2 million by Friday, Margot," Derek murmured, taking a sip of his scotch. "Or I send the old Denver files to the authorities, and you go down long before your husband does." Julian returned to Pemberton Tech the next morning, the ghost of Derek's words echoing in the sterile silence of his corner office. The old Denver files. Margot wasn't just a cheating wife executing a hostile takeover. She was a hostage paying a ransom with Julian's life's work. The revelation did not soften his rage. It only sharpened the blade he was preparing to drive through both of them. He summoned Brian Cooper to the basement server room, a subterranean vault of blinking blue lights and freezing, climate-controlled air. "I need a standalone decoy server," Julian instructed, his breath pluming faintly in the chill. "Stock it with fabricated ledgers. Make them look exactly like the embezzled funds Derek is expecting to find. But I want every single kilobyte watermarked with a cryptographic trapdoor. When she plugs that silver flash drive into my terminal, I want a time-stamped, unalterable record of the exact device extracting the data and the malicious code it leaves behind." Brian nodded slowly, his fingers flying across a diagnostic keyboard. "You're giving them the murder weapon, Julian." "I'm giving them a loaded gun with a plugged barrel," Julian corrected, his voice devoid of any warmth. "When they pull the trigger, it blows up in their hands." By late Thursday afternoon, the snare was set. The baited file sat on his primary desktop, poorly disguised under a benign folder named Q3_projections_draft. Julian knew Margot's rhythms. She routinely visited the executive floor on Thursdays under the guise of bringing him specialty coffee or his dry cleaning, always ensuring she had a few minutes alone in his suite while he was supposedly in the weekly operations briefing. At exactly 4 o'clock, his intercom buzzed. "Mr. St. James, your wife is here," his assistant announced. "Send her in," Julian replied. He stood up, deliberately nudging his mouse to keep the monitor glowing. The Q3_projections_draft folder remained open, highly visible, and fatally vulnerable. Margot entered, a vision in a tailored ivory trench coat, carrying 2 cups from their favorite cafe. She smiled, a perfect, practiced curve of her lips that made Julian's stomach turn into a block of ice. "I hope I'm not interrupting your flow." "Never," Julian lied smoothly. He checked his watch, feigning a sudden spike of corporate stress. "Actually, your timing is a lifesaver. I have to step down the hall to the boardroom for 10 minutes to handle a legal dispute. Make yourself comfortable, darling. I'll be right back." He kissed her cheek, a brief, chilling contact, and walked out the heavy oak door. He did not go to the boardroom. Instead, Julian stepped into the adjacent security alcove, where Brian had established a live, encrypted feed of his office. On the high-resolution monitor, Julian watched his wife. She waited exactly 30 seconds before her demeanor shifted from relaxed elegance to sharp, predatory focus. She moved swiftly behind his mahogany desk. Reaching into the deep pocket of her trench coat, she retrieved the small, silver flash drive he had seen at the Archer Hotel. Julian's jaw tightened as she slipped the drive into the side of his monitor. The download progress bar appeared on the surveillance screen, a bright green line inching rapidly toward his supposed destruction. It was a Tuesday morning when the guillotine finally fell. The Pemberton Tech boardroom was a cavern of glass and steel, suspended high above the San Francisco fog. Julian sat at the head of the long oak table, projecting the aura of an untouchable CEO, though his eyes constantly tracked the second hand of his platinum watch. He knew the timeline. He was just waiting for the executioner to arrive. Arthur Vance, the company's lead legal counsel and a man whose loyalties were notoriously malleable, cleared his throat. He did not look at the quarterly projections glowing on the screen. Instead, he placed a thick, leather-bound dossier onto the polished wood. The soft thud echoed like a gunshot. Before we proceed, Julian, the board has received a highly concerning anonymous submission, Arthur stated, the room's ambient chatter dying instantly. It contains heavily documented financial irregularities, specifically the routing of corporate funds into offshore shell accounts bearing your exact digital signature. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, allowing a perfectly calibrated look of mild confusion to cross his features. Are you proposing a hostile audit based on a phantom email, Arthur? It wasn't an email, Arthur replied, his voice tightening with nervous energy. He reached into his breast pocket and placed a small object next to the dossier. It gleamed under the harsh overhead lights, the exact silver flash drive Margot had stolen from his desk. It was hand-delivered this morning. Along with this, as if on cue, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. A sleek, unfamiliar man in a charcoal suit stepped into the room. He bypassed the bewildered executives, walking straight to the head of the table, and placed a thick manila envelope directly over Julian's perfectly aligned notepad. Julian St. James? You've been served, the process server said, his tone entirely devoid of emotion, before turning on his heel and exiting the silent room. The quiet that followed was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled with corporate blood. Julian stared at the envelope. He didn't need to break the seal to know what it contained. Margot's petition for dissolution of marriage, explicitly citing severe financial misconduct to trigger the morality clause and void their ironclad prenuptial agreement. It was a flawlessly synchronized strike. She was attempting to sever his marriage, seize his wealth, and eject him from his own empire in a single, brutal motion. Around the table, the board members exchanged panicked, sidelong glances. Derek Stone's invisible hand was suffocating the room. They were waiting for Julian to crack, to demand his private lawyers, to show the frantic weakness of a guilty man. The agonizing urge to stand up, to rip the dossier apart and reveal the trap right then, burned intensely against his ribs. But Julian simply picked up the envelope, his fingers tracing the crisp edge of the paper. His pulse remained an icy, steady rhythm. He looked at Arthur, his expression an impenetrable, terrifying mask. We will recess for exactly 1 hour, Julian commanded, his voice soft but carrying the weight of an anvil. And no one is leaving this floor. 59 minutes later, Julian re-entered the boardroom. Brian Cooper trailed silently behind him, moving with the lethal grace of a shadow, and plugged a decryption key into the primary projector. The executives, pale and restless from the agonizing wait, watched as the massive screen illuminated not with the incriminating ledgers, but with lines of stark, pulsing red code. Arthur, Julian began, his voice a quiet, resonant threat in the cavernous space. You brought a stolen flash drive into my firm. If you had bothered to authorize a basic forensic diagnostic, you would have seen the cryptographic watermark embedded in every single cell of those spreadsheets. Julian tapped the presentation remote. The screen zoomed in on a hidden metadata string, flashing brilliantly against the dark background. These files were generated on a quarantine decoy server exactly 72 hours ago, Julian explained, watching the blood drain from Arthur's face. Furthermore, the MAC address of the device that extracted them matches my wife's personal laptop. It was a beautifully executed frame job, but unfortunately for the architect, the moment that drive was plugged into this network, it downloaded a reverse beacon payload. The mutiny died before it could draw a single breath. The board of directors stared at Julian in absolute silence, paralyzed by the sudden realization that they had almost aligned themselves against an apex predator who was 10 steps ahead. Arthur is terminated, effective immediately, Julian commanded, not breaking eye contact with the trembling lawyer. Security will escort him out. With his empire secured, Julian retreated to his soundproof office. But the true victory, and the true nightmare, lay waiting on his desk. Brian was already standing by the monitors, his expression uncharacteristically grim. The beacon didn't just prove the files were fake, Julian. It traced the drive back to Derek Stone's private network and cloned his encrypted root directory. You need to see this. Julian rounded the desk. On the screen was a heavily encrypted folder simply labeled Denver_2015. He clicked it open. The contents had nothing to do with Pemberton Tech. They were scanned police reports, suppressed court documents, and offshore bank statements detailing a massive, unsolved wire fraud scheme in Colorado. The primary suspect, who had narrowly escaped federal indictment due to a mysteriously vanished witness, was Margot Sinclair. Julian stared at a decade-old photograph of his wife, her eyes sharp and desperate. The jagged pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together. Derek Stone hadn't merely seduced Margot to steal the company. He had weaponized her past. Stone had somehow unearthed the Denver files and used them to blackmail her into orchestrating the corporate coup. The hotel rendezvous, the stolen flash drive, the divorce papers. It was all a frantic, terrified attempt by Margot to keep herself out of a federal penitentiary. She wasn't just a traitor. She was a hostage on Derek's leash. And now, Julian held the leash. The silence of the office was shattered by the sharp vibration of Julian's phone on the mahogany wood. The screen lit up with a new text message from Margot. Did you get the papers? We need to talk tonight. Julian did not reply to Margot's text. He did not return to the penthouse at the Meridian. Instead, he instructed Brian Cooper to arrange a very specific, highly discreet meeting. The location was not a corporate boardroom or a public restaurant, but the private, subterranean wine cellar of the Rosewood Country Club. It was a space reserved for the elite, insulated by thick stone walls and a suffocating silence. The perfect environment for an execution. Derek Stone arrived at exactly 8 o'clock. He wore a tailored navy suit and the relaxed, arrogant smirk of a man who believed he had just engineered the perfect corporate assassination. He descended the spiral staircase, his footsteps echoing in the damp, temperature-controlled air, and found Julian waiting at a heavy oak tasting table. Julian, Derek said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy as he pulled out a leather chair. To what do I owe this late-night invitation? I assumed you would be entirely occupied with your divorce attorneys and criminal defense team. The board looked quite rattled today. Julian poured a measure of vintage Bordeaux into a crystal glass. His movements were hypnotic, unhurried, and entirely devoid of the panic Derek had expected to see. Julian did not look at Derek's face. He looked through him, viewing the man not as a rival, but as a solved equation. I am a man who appreciates a well-constructed mechanism, Derek, Julian began, his voice a low, resonant hum in the cavernous room. The decoy flash drive, the morality clause, the synchronized boardroom ambush. It was ambitious, but it possessed a fatal flaw. You underestimated the architecture of my network. Derek's smirk faltered by a fraction of a millimeter, but he leaned back, crossing his arms in a defensive posture. I have no idea what you are talking about. Your wife filed the papers. Your board has the offshore ledgers. You are finished. The ledgers you received were generated on a quarantined server, Julian stated softly, taking a slow sip of the dark wine. They were cryptographically watermarked. And when Margot plugged your silver flash drive into my terminal, it did not just steal fabricated documents. It delivered a reverse beacon payload that mapped your entire personal network, bypassed your firewalls, and cloned your encrypted root directory. Derek froze. The color began to visibly drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His posture stiffened, the arrogant venture capitalist instantly replaced by a cornered, terrified animal. Julian pulled a thin, unmarked manila folder from his briefcase and slid it across the polished oak table. It stopped inches from Derek's trembling hands. "I know about the Denver files, Derek," Julian said, the temperature in the room seeming to drop 10 degrees. "I know exactly what happened in 2015. And more importantly, I have the digital footprint proving that you used that suppressed police report to extort my wife." Derek did not touch the folder. His eyes darted toward the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs. "You have nothing. Extortion is a heavy word, Julian. It's a bluff. It is a federal crime," Julian corrected, his voice dropping to a glacial, uncompromising whisper. "And I have the complete, unalterable digital trail. The encrypted emails from your IP address, the offshore wire routing you demanded from her as payment, the high-resolution audio files of your threats secured at the Archer Hotel. It is a meticulously documented felony." Panic finally shattered Derek's facade. He leaned forward, his voice a desperate, frantic hiss. "Listen to me, Julian. We can make a deal. I will resign from my firm tomorrow. I will sign over my equity in the new startup. You keep Pemberton Tech, you keep your wealth. But if you expose me, you expose her. The Colorado District Attorney will reopen the wire fraud case. Margot will go to federal prison for a decade. You would destroy your own wife? She ceased being my wife the moment she conspired to steal my life's work," Julian replied, his expression an impenetrable mask of ice. "You thought her paralyzing fear of prison was your ultimate leverage against me. You failed to realize that I no longer care what happens to her. I am not going to use this information to negotiate, Derek. I am going to use it to bury you." Julian reached into his pocket and placed his sleek, black smartphone on the table. The screen was illuminated, showing a sent email confirmation. 30 minutes ago, my security contractor transmitted the complete contents of your encrypted drive to the SEC, the FBI field office, and the ethics committee of your own board of directors, Julian stated, standing up from the table. He buttoned his suit jacket with absolute, chilling precision. "They have the undeniable proof of your corporate espionage and the exhaustive evidence of your extortion." Derek stared at the phone as if it were a live explosive. He slumped back in his chair, the oxygen leaving his lungs in a ragged gasp. "My board. They'll strip my shares. The feds will seize all my assets. I have nothing. By tomorrow morning, you will be professionally radioactive and legally indefensible," Julian confirmed, his tone entirely devoid of triumph or malice, merely stating an inevitable fact. "You tried to take my empire, so I took your life. And Margot?" Derek asked, his voice cracking, a pathetic, spiteful attempt to drag Julian down into the wreckage with him. "What happens when the FBI knocks on her door at the penthouse?" "That," Julian said, turning away and walking toward the stone staircase, "is a problem for her criminal defense attorney." The San Francisco fog returned, thicker and colder than it had been on the morning Julian first touched that cursed iPad. It pressed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Meridian penthouse, blurring the glittering lights of the tech empire he had so ruthlessly defended. The apartment was profoundly silent. The subtle, ambient sounds of a shared life, the clinking of a porcelain mug, the rustle of silk, the faint, lingering scent of jasmine, had been meticulously scrubbed away by a team of professional cleaners. All that remained was the sterile smell of bleach and the vast, echoing emptiness of 10,000 square feet. 3 weeks had passed since the execution in the wine cellar. The fallout had been surgical and absolute. Derek Stone's venture capital firm had imploded within 48 hours of the SEC raid. His assets were frozen, his reputation reduced to radioactive ash, and he was currently awaiting trial, stripped of his passport and his arrogant pride. Margot's demise had been quieter, but infinitely more devastating. The FBI had not knocked on the penthouse door. They had intercepted her at San Francisco International Airport, a one-way ticket to Zurich trembling in her manicured hand. The Colorado District Attorney, armed with Julian's decrypted dossier, had unsealed the 2015 wire fraud indictment. The prenuptial agreement she had fought so desperately to break was now entirely irrelevant. She wasn't fighting for Julian's wealth anymore. She was fighting for her freedom, a battle her defense attorneys privately admitted was already lost. Julian stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, a ghost haunting his own life. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves meticulously rolled to the elbows, his platinum watch ticking a steady, indifferent rhythm against his wrist. On the kitchen's marble island, the exact spot where this war had silently begun, sat a thick stack of legal documents. He walked slowly toward the island, the hardwood floor cold beneath his bare feet. The manila envelope bore the seal of his private legal counsel. He slid the documents out. They were the finalized, expedited divorce decrees, legally severing him from Margot Sinclair forever. The state had moved quickly, eager to untangle a prominent CEO from a newly minted federal inmate. Julian stared at the stark black ink on the heavy white parchment. Dissolution of marriage. Irreconcilable differences. The legal terminology felt painfully inadequate. There was no clause for extortion, no subparagraph for the exact moment a husband decides to lock his wife in a cage to save his company. He reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a heavy Mont Blanc pen. It had been an anniversary gift from Margot 5 years ago. A lifetime ago. He uncapped it, the gold nib gleaming under the harsh, recessed lighting of the kitchen. He did not hesitate. He did not let his hand tremble. Julian pressed the pen to the signature line on the final page. The scratch of metal against paper was the loudest sound in the room, a violent, tearing noise that finalized the destruction of a decade. He signed his name with the same sharp, angular precision he used to authorize corporate liquidations. When he finished, he carefully recapped the pen and set it down precisely parallel to the edge of the documents. The trap was sprung. The enemies were vanquished. The empire of Pemberton Tech was completely, unassailably his. Yet, as Julian looked around the immaculate, hollow penthouse, an icy realization began to seep into his bones, freezing the last remaining warmth in his chest. He had protected his assets with absolute perfection, but in the process, he had surgically removed his own capacity to feel. He had outplayed a sociopath by becoming one himself. The victory was a sprawling, magnificent graveyard. He left the papers on the island and walked slowly toward the massive window overlooking the bay. The city below was a tapestry of golden lights, millions of people living their messy, vulnerable, intertwined lives. Julian stood entirely alone, a king in an empty, glass tower, insulated from the world by his wealth and his ruthlessness. He placed one hand against the cold pane of glass, staring at his own faint reflection in the window. "I kept the empire, Margot," Julian whispered to the empty room, his voice devoid of triumph, hollowed out by the agonizing weight of his flawless survival. "But I burned down the only kingdom that mattered."